They had been told the Americans were starving. They had been told the civilians ate scraps, that meat was rare, that bread was rationed to crumbs, that prisoners would be fed just enough to stay alive. They had been told the camps would be brutal, humiliating, and cold. They had been told that surrender meant hunger. So when the first plate was set down in front of them, many of the German prisoners thought it was a mistake. The man behind the counter waited. Steam rose from the food. The smell was unmistakable. Real meat, potatoes, bread that was not gray or stretched with fillers, a ladle of vegetables that looked like they had come from a farm, not a laboratory. The prisoner stared at it too long. "Go on," the American guard said, not unkindly. "Eat." The prisoner hesitated, then sat, then took a bite. And for the first time since the war had begun, he felt full. When German soldiers began surrendering in large numbers in North Africa in 1943, most of them believed they would never see Germany again. They had been told captivity in American hands would be worse than death. Nazi propaganda had been relentless on that point. The United States, they were told, was a land of racial chaos, worker revolts, and starvation lines. Americans, they were told, hoarded food for themselves and punished enemies without mercy. The men who surrendered expected camps made of barbed wire and dirt, guarded by angry men who spoke a language they did not understand and did not care to learn. What they got instead was something far more confusing. They got schedules. They got rules that were enforced politely. They got male privileges. And most unsettling of all, they got food. Plenty of it. The United States was unprepared for many things during World War II, but feeding people was not one of them. American farms were producing more than the population could consume. Mechanization, fertilizer, and vast land reserves meant surplus was the norm, not the exception. Rationing existed, but it was structured and predictable. By contrast, Germany by 1943 was already hungry. Allied bombing, loss of territory, and the strain of a total war economy had reduced civilian rations sharply. Meat was rare, butter was rationed, bread was adulterated. German soldiers arriving in American custody carried hunger with them like an extra piece of equipment. The first POW camps in the United States were built quickly, often on land originally intended for training or storage. By the end of the war, more than 500 camps would exist across the country, holding over 400,000 Axis prisoners, the vast majority of them German. The camps were not luxurious, they were basic. Wooden barracks, gravel paths, fences, watchtowers. But they were clean, and they followed rules. The most important rule was not American at all. It was international. The Geneva Convention of 1929 required that prisoners of war be treated humanely, housed adequately, and fed rations equivalent to those of the detaining power's own troops. The United States took this seriously, partly because it believed in the rule of law, partly because it expected its own soldiers to be captured and wanted them treated the same way, and partly because, in practical terms, it could afford it. This created a situation that stunned the prisoners. They were fed the same food as American soldiers, sometimes more. In Camp Shelby, Mississippi, German POWs lined up 3 times a day for meals that included meat, vegetables, bread, and coffee. Not ersatz coffee, real coffee. In Camp Cook, California, prisoners received fresh fruit several times a week. In Camp Algona, Iowa, Prisoners working on local farms returned to camp with stories that bordered on disbelief. American farmers fed them lunch alongside hired hands, thick sandwiches, milk, pie. Some prisoners thought it was a trick. They waited for the punishment. It did not come. The real shock came a few weeks into captivity. That was when the prisoners learned they could ask for seconds. At first, no one dared. In Germany, asking for more food was pointless. There was no more food. In the army, complaining about rations could get you disciplined. So when an American cook casually asked, "You want more potatoes?" the prisoner thought he had misheard. The cook repeated the question. The prisoner nodded cautiously. The ladle dipped again. Word spread quickly. Within days, German prisoners were talking among themselves in low voices, trying to understand what was happening. Some believed the Americans were trying to fatten them up for forced labor. Others thought it was psychological warfare. One prisoner wrote later that he assumed the kindness would end at any moment. It did not. Not all camps were the same. Conditions varied by location, leadership, and resources. But across the system, the same patterns emerged. Food was plentiful. Rules were enforced calmly. Violence was rare. This did not mean the camps were free of tension. German prisoners brought their own hierarchy with them. Hardcore Nazis intimidated others. Informal courts were held. Some prisoners were punished by fellow Germans for cooperating with Americans. The U.S. military eventually separated committed Nazis from other prisoners to prevent abuse. Even so, the Americans did not reduce rations as punishment. They continued to feed everyone. American guards were often young men who had never met a German before. Many had expected fanatics. What they found instead were tired soldiers who missed home and complained about food they would have once considered a feast. Guards noticed something strange. The prisoners were gaining weight. Medical officers confirmed it. German POWs in American camps were healthier than many American civilians in Europe. This was not lost on the prisoners themselves. One former Wehrmacht corporal later said that captivity was the first time since 1939 that he had eaten until he was satisfied. Another admitted that he felt guilty writing home about it, knowing his family was hungry. Letters were censored, but the truth leaked out anyway. In Camp Shelby, Mississippi, German POWs lined up 3 times a day for meals that included meat, vegetables, bread, and coffee. Not ersatz coffee, real coffee. In Camp Cook, California, prisoners received fresh fruit several times a week. In Camp Algona, Iowa, prisoners working on local farms returned to camp with stories that bordered on disbelief. American farmers fed them lunch alongside hired hands, thick sandwiches, milk, pie. Some prisoners thought it was a trick. They waited for the punishment. It did not come. The real shock came a few weeks into captivity. That was when the prisoners learned they could ask for seconds. At first, no one dared. In Germany, asking for more food was pointless. There was no more food. In the army, complaining about rations could get you disciplined. So when an American cook casually asked, "You want more potatoes?" the prisoner thought he had misheard. The cook repeated the question. The prisoner nodded cautiously. The ladle dipped again. Word spread quickly. Within days, German prisoners were talking among themselves in low voices, trying to understand what was happening. Some believed the Americans were trying to fatten them up for forced labor. Others thought it was psychological warfare. One prisoner wrote later that he assumed the kindness would end at any moment. It did not. Not all camps were the same. Conditions varied by location, leadership, and resources. But across the system, the same patterns emerged. Food was plentiful. Rules were enforced calmly. Violence was rare. This did not mean the camps were free of tension. German prisoners brought their own hierarchy with them. Hardcore Nazis intimidated others. Informal courts were held. Some prisoners were punished by fellow Germans for cooperating with Americans. The U.S. military eventually separated committed Nazis from other prisoners to prevent abuse. Even so, the Americans did not reduce rations as punishment. They continued to feed everyone. American guards were often young men who had never met a German before. Many had expected fanatics. What they found instead were tired soldiers who missed home and complained about food they would have once considered a feast. Guards noticed something strange. The prisoners were gaining weight. Medical officers confirmed it. German POWs in American camps were healthier than many American civilians in Europe. This was not lost on the prisoners themselves. One former Wehrmacht corporal later said that captivity was the first time since 1939 that he had eaten until he was satisfied. Another admitted that he felt guilty writing home about it, knowing his family was hungry. Letters were censored, but the truth leaked out anyway. In Germany, rumors spread. Prisoners in America were eating well, very well. Nazi authorities tried to suppress these stories, calling them lies, but soldiers returning from captivity after the war confirmed them. For many Germans, this realization was deeply unsettling. The enemy they had been taught to fear and despise had treated their captured soldiers better than their own government had treated civilians. The food was not accidental. American camp commanders kept meticulous records. Caloric intake was calculated. Menus were planned weeks in advance. Complaints were logged and addressed. When supplies ran short, commanders requested more. When prisoners worked on local farms or infrastructure projects, they were paid small wages, which they could spend at camp canteens. The canteens sold items unheard of in wartime Germany: candy, tobacco, soap, even musical instruments. Food remained the most discussed topic, always. One German prisoner recalled his first Thanksgiving in an American camp. He had never heard of the holiday before. The meal included turkey, mashed potatoes, gravy, bread, vegetables, and pie. Real pie. The prisoners ate slowly, suspiciously, waiting for the moment when it would stop. It never did. That night, many of them lay awake, not from hunger, but from the uncomfortable fullness they had forgotten was possible. This treatment did not convert prisoners into Americans overnight. Many remained loyal to Germany. Some resented captivity deeply. But it did something else. It broke the image they had been given. The United States was not starving. It was not cruel. It was organized, confident, and strangely generous. This realization stayed with them long after the war. By 1945, when German prisoners were repatriated, many returned thinner emotionally than physically. They went back to bombed cities, empty shelves, and shattered beliefs. They carried memories of American camps that felt unreal in comparison. Years later, some would say that captivity had been the first time they truly questioned what they had been told. Not because of lectures, not because of re-education programs, but because someone had offered them seconds. The American POW camps were dismantled quietly after the war. Barracks were torn down or repurposed. Fields returned to farmland. But the stories remained. In memoirs, letters, and interviews, former prisoners repeated the same detail again and again. The food, the disbelief, the moment they realized the enemy had not starved them. History often remembers wars by their battles, but sometimes it is remembered by a plate set down without ceremony, by a ladle dipping twice, and by a question asked casually in a language the prisoner barely understood. Do you want more? For thousands of German soldiers, that question marked the moment when everything they believed about the war began to unravel. Not with violence, not with speeches, but with a second helping. They did not talk about it loudly at first. In the camps, food was discussed in the same way men discuss miracles, carefully, skeptically, and always with the expectation that it might disappear if examined too closely. A plate that was too full felt temporary. A meal that ended with satisfaction felt suspicious. Many of the prisoners ate slowly, not because they were savoring the taste, but because they were waiting for interruption. In Germany, meals ended when supplies ran out, not when hunger did. Here, the line moved forward calmly, the kitchen staff unhurried, the pots still heavy. Some prisoners hid bread in their pockets out of habit. Others forced themselves to eat everything immediately, fearing the rules might change by the next meal. They did not. Days passed, then weeks. The food kept coming. By late 1943, the system was running smoothly. German POWs were being shipped by train across the United States, often under conditions that confused them even more. The trains stopped regularly. Guards allowed prisoners to stretch their legs. Sometimes civilians waved. One prisoner later said that the kindness felt worse than cruelty. Cruelty made sense. Kindness from an enemy did not. When the trains arrived at their destinations, the camps looked nothing like the propaganda images they had been shown. There were fences and towers, yes, but there were also baseball fields, libraries, chapels, and kitchens that never seemed empty. In Camp Papago Park, Arizona, prisoners worked in the desert heat during the day and returned to meals that replaced the calories they had burned. Stews thick with meat, bread baked fresh on site, fruit shipped from California. In Camp McCain, Mississippi, prisoners were issued milk daily. For many, it was the first time they had drunk milk regularly since childhood. The monotony of captivity was broken by meals. Breakfast arrived early, lunch followed work details, dinner marked the end of the day. The predictability itself was unsettling. In war, uncertainty was constant. Hunger was part of it. Here, hunger was removed. The guards noticed the change before the prisoners did. German POWs who had arrived thin and exhausted began to stand straighter. Faces filled out. Illness declined. camp doctors filed reports noting improved health and weight gain. Some guards joked that the prisoners were eating better than they were. In many cases, this was true. American civilians faced rationing. Sugar, meat, butter, and gasoline were limited, but the military supply system prioritized consistency, and the Geneva Convention required equivalence. So the prisoners were fed like soldiers, sometimes better. This did not sit well with everyone. Letters reached Washington complaining that enemy soldiers were being treated too well, that American boys were dying overseas while Germans ate meat in safety. The War Department responded with form letters and policy statements. The rules were clear. The rules would be followed. The camps remained unchanged. Inside the wire, the food altered relationships. Men who once followed strict Nazi discipline began to question authority. When survival was no longer tied to obedience, fear lost its edge. Hardcore Nazis tried to maintain control, discouraging cooperation with Americans, punishing those who worked willingly. But even they lined up for meals. Hunger does not respect ideology. At night, arguments broke out in hushed voices, not about politics, about reality. If this is America, then what were we fighting? No one answered. American cooks were rarely aware of the impact they were having. To them, it was routine. Men needed calories, pots needed filling, ladles dipped until empty. Some cooks learned a few German words. Others did not bother. Communication was mostly gestures, a raised eyebrow, an extended plate, a nod. Seconds were offered without comment. The simplicity of it unsettled the prisoners more than any speech could have. Work details became another point of disbelief. German POWs were sent to farms, lumber camps, and construction sites. Labor shortages made their work valuable. Farmers treated them like hired hands, not enemies. They ate meals at family tables. They drank coffee that was not rationed carefully. They were paid small wages and allowed to buy food at camp canteens. Candy, cookies, chocolate, items that had disappeared from German shelves years earlier. Some prisoners mailed these treats home after the war. Others kept them as proof, showing them to neighbors who refused to believe. Thanksgiving was the day most often mentioned later. The holiday meant nothing to the prisoners when they first heard about it. Another American ritual, another unfamiliar word. Then the meal arrived. Turkey, gravy, mashed potatoes, vegetables, pie. The room fell silent. One prisoner later said he felt ashamed eating so much while his family rationed turnips. Another said he cried quietly after the meal, overwhelmed not by generosity, but by confusion. Why would an enemy do this? The answer was never explained to them directly. There were no lectures at the dinner table, no speeches before meals, no banners proclaiming moral superiority. The Americans simply fed them, again and again and again. By 1944, the contrast between life in American camps and life in Germany had grown impossible to ignore. Letters from home described bombed cities and empty stores. Families survived on substitutes and scraps. Prisoners stopped writing about food. Censors noticed. The silence said enough. When the war ended in Europe in May 1945, celebrations erupted across the camps. Guards relaxed, schedules softened. Meals remained unchanged. For many prisoners, the announcement of Germany's surrender was not met with joy or despair, but numbness. They had been fed through the collapse. They had survived comfortably while their country burned. This realization followed them home. Repatriation came slowly. Trains carried former prisoners east again, thinner in belief than in body. They returned to cities that no longer resembled the ones they remembered. When neighbors asked about captivity, many spoke first about the food. Not the fences, not the guards, the food, the disbelief, the seconds. Years later, historians would debate the impact of American POW policy. Some would argue it helped stabilize post-war Europe. Others would dismiss it as logistical convenience. But the men who lived it remembered one thing clearly. They had expected to starve. Instead, they had been fed. In a war defined by destruction, the most shocking weapon turned out to be abundance. And for thousands of German soldiers, the moment the war truly changed was not a battle. It was a quiet question, asked without irony.